He asked if I was alone, but he already knew. Some noises have a way of turning the whole world into a question. I house sit for my parents when they travel. It's something I do more out of habit than duty. Their place sits on a narrow mountain road that winds away from the county line, a lane planked with ruts and ice when winter comes. The house is old in a patient way. Low ceilings, a sagging porch, a wood stove that takes a temper. That Christmas Eve, the sky dropped a freezing rain that turned trees into glass and the road into a mirror. My parents were gone visiting my sister and the kids. I stayed because the pipes needed attention and because the house felt like a place that would hold me up if I needed it. I liked the hush that came with being the only one there. I liked the way you could hear the world rearrange itself. The storm felt like an animal, folding itself over the land. The power blinked off just before midnight. A clean, solitary death of sound when clocks stopped and the refrigerator went quiet. Some memories don't fade. They wait. And every Christmas, this one steps out of the tree line again. I'm not the kind of person who scares easy. I grew up in the mountains, the kind of place where silence isn't empty. It's a landscape of its own. I know the sound of deer moving through brush, the difference between a man's step and a branch giving way, the shift in air pressure when the weather turns. But what happened that winter wasn't weather, and it wasn't wildlife. It was something patient, something watching. Every year, I spent Christmas at my grandfather's cabin. Even after he passed, I kept the tradition alive because, I don't know, the place felt like him. The old stove that clicked before it heated, the pine boards that held the smell of smoke in their grain, the crooked window frame he always promised he'd fix. The cabin sits deep enough in the foothills that the nearest neighbor is almost 3 miles away, and the only road that leads to it narrows into a path that barely looks man-made. The pines crowd in close, like they're leaning over your shoulders to see what you're doing. Most people would call that unsettling. I always found it comforting. That year, Christmas came early, or at least the winter part of it did. Heavy snow rolled in 3 days ahead of schedule, thick enough that the whole world felt slow, quiet. Like everything outside had paused just long enough for you to hear yourself breathe. I got to the cabin just before the storm closed the road, settled in, and spent most of Christmas Eve reading by the fire. It was the kind of night where the crackle of burning wood feels louder than it should, and every shadow in the corner seems sharper because of the orange glow. I wasn't expecting anything strange, but strange doesn't need permission. It started with footsteps. At first, just a single crunch, muted by fresh snow. I heard it from the couch. One soft impact somewhere outside the window. Should have been nothing. Should have been a deer or a fox, or even snow shifting off a branch. But then came another. And another. Steady, measured, not wandering, not hesitant. A rhythm. I sat up slowly, letting the quiet settle around me like a second skin. The fire was burning low, just red cracks of ember breaking through the dark, and without the full light, The cabin felt smaller, the walls closer. My pulse was steady at first, almost calm, because I've heard plenty of animals outside that cabin. But there was something about this sound, the weight of it, the spacing, the direction. It wasn't circling, it was approaching. I froze when the footsteps stopped directly behind the living room window. Not off to the side, not shuffling or sniffing, just stopped, right where a person would stand if they wanted to look in. I stared at the drawn curtains, thin cotton, that suddenly felt too flimsy to mean anything. I didn't move, didn't breathe. That's when I heard it. A low hum. Not a tune, not quite a voice, just a vibration. Like someone letting sound escape through closed lips. It didn't match the cold outside. It didn't even sound like an attempt to communicate. It sounded aware, like it knew I was on the other side of the glass. The hum trailed off slowly. My hands had gone cold. My legs were tight against the couch, ready to run, even though there was nowhere to run to. I tried to swallow and couldn't. My throat felt locked, like my body didn't want to make noise. I told myself it was a trick of acoustics. I told myself anything that made sense. But after a full minute of silence, I stood and moved toward the window. Not bold, more like I was being pulled by something I didn't want to believe. I eased the curtain open just a hair, letting in a sliver of moonlight. That's when I saw him. A man, standing at the edge of the tree line. He wasn't bundled up the way you'd expect. No hat, no hood, just a dark coat dusted with snow, arms at his sides. He wasn't shivering, wasn't shifting his feet. He didn't even seem bothered by the cold. He stood like he'd been carved out of the night itself. I dropped the curtain instinctively, heart thudding against my ribs. My mind started doing frantic math. Hunters? Lost hikers? Someone's truck broken down on the road? But none of the answers fit. Nobody stands perfectly still in sub-zero temperatures unless they want to. After a few seconds, I forced myself to look again. I don't know why. Maybe because not knowing felt worse than seeing. I peeled the curtain back another inch. He was closer. Not drastically, maybe 4 feet. But I hadn't seen him move. His posture hadn't changed. He just shortened the distance between us, as if the world rearranged itself while I blinked. My breath hitched in my throat. I checked again. Closer. Checked again. Closer still. Each time the curtain fell shut, and I opened it again. He gained distance, without ever lifting a foot. The worst part wasn't the proximity. It was the purpose behind it. A deliberate way he advanced, only when unobserved. Like a rule he followed, a rule he enjoyed. I don't know how long that went on. The fire died down to nothing, and without its warmth, the cabin grew cold. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to press them against my thighs to keep them still. At one point, I stumbled backward, knocking into the coffee table. The mug from earlier rattled and fell on its side, spilling cold coffee across the wood. The sound echoed too loudly in the quiet cabin. Far too loudly. That was when I realized the footsteps had stopped completely. When I checked the window one more time, not even fully looking, just an instinctive peek, he was so close the moon illuminated the lower half of his face. His mouth was curled into a smile, not mocking, not kind, a knowing smile. The kind someone gives when a secret finally clicks into place. I staggered back from the window, the air thinning in my lungs. Something inside me, something primal, finally screamed, "Move." I rushed to the back door to check the lock, then the kitchen windows, then the hallway, bedroom. Everything was locked, thank God, but my relief was thin and fragile, because locks only help against people who fear consequences. This man didn't look afraid of anything. For nearly an hour, I sat with my back against the wall between the kitchen and the living room, listening for movement, waiting for the steps to come around the cabin, waiting for a tap on the window, waiting for anything. Instead, there was nothing. Silence, thick and unmoving. The snow stopped. The wind paused. Even the trees seemed to hold their breath. It was a silence that didn't occur naturally. A silence that felt arranged. Finally, desperate for answers, or closure, or maybe just proof that he wasn't real, I crept toward the front window again. The floorboards creaked under my weight. One of those familiar cabin sounds that never bothered me before. That night, they sounded like betrayal. I lifted the curtain slowly. He was gone. The tree line was empty. Just black trunks, pale snow, and a moon that seemed too bright for the hour. The space where he had stood, where he had smiled, was untouched, like the night had erased him clean. For a moment I felt stupid, embarrassed, like fear had made me imagine movement where there was none. But when I stepped onto the porch, because I needed reality under my feet, I saw them. Tracks, human prints, spaced in a perfect, deliberate line, leading straight toward the cabin, but stopping about 5 feet from the porch. After that, nothing. Not a single print trailing back. No, not a single indication he'd left. Just an endpoint, like he vanished the moment he finished approaching. My breath fogged the air in front of me. The cold chewed at my fingers, and all I could think was, how long was he watching before I noticed him? Inside, the cabin felt smaller than ever. I shut the door, locked it, pushed a chair under the knob, even though I knew how pointless it was. I didn't sleep. I barely blinked. My eyes stayed locked on the window until dawn bled its way through the trees. By morning, the tracks were gone, buried under fresh snow. The world looked untouched, like the night had never happened. I left the cabin before noon. I didn't clean up, didn't pack properly. I just drove, fast, too fast for the icy road, but fear overrides caution in ways you don't expect. I didn't go back for nearly a year. When I finally did, against my better judgment, the cabin was exactly as I left it. Dusty, cold, still holding the shape of my panic. But something else was there. Outside the front window, at the exact distance where the tracks had ended the year before, The snow was disturbed in a neat, purposeful circle. Not footprints, not animal, just a shallow impression, like someone had stood there for hours, watching, waiting. The sheriff told me it was probably kids messing around. My sister said it was my grief talking. And maybe they're right, but sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see that smile again. That patient, knowing smile. The one that didn't belong to a stranger trying to get inside. It belonged to someone who already felt like they were. And every Christmas, I can't shake the feeling he's still out there, just beyond the tree line, waiting for me to look through the glass again. If you made it this far, subscribe for more true horror stories like this one. Some memories don't fade, they wait. And every Christmas, this one steps out of the tree line again. I'm not the kind of person who scares easy. I grew up in the mountains, the kind of place where silence isn't empty, it's a landscape of its own. I know the sound of deer moving through brush, the difference between a man's step and a branch giving way, the shift in air pressure when the weather turns. But what happened that winter wasn't weather, and it wasn't wildlife. It was something patient, something watching. The silence that dropped in its place had texture. It pressed against my face when I opened the door, sharp and metallic, like breath on the back of the neck. The house made noises in the dark that I knew by memory. The pop of the wood stove as it settled, the soft creak of the frame when wind pressed against it. Those sounds are ordinary. They speak of age and cold and weathered joints. They are supposed to be reassuring because you can name them. That night, they were a map I had already read. The first sound that didn't belong to the house came from above. It was a thud, not hail or falling branch, deliberate and heavy, a distinct impact that rattled the plaster. It landed somewhere on the roof, and then was followed by a dragging sound that ran from one end of the house to the other. An even, slow rasp, like rubber soles on wet shingles. I froze. My first thought was practical, an animal. Raccoons used to come in seasons, but the stories say something took care of them a few winters back. Still, animal or not, the timing felt wrong. The step had weight and cadence like a person. I listened for the pattern. It had a rhythm. It had direction. I clicked on the flashlight. The beam sliced the kitchen in a thin, mechanical white and did exactly what lights always do. It made shadows long and mean. The moment the light touched the ceiling, the noise stopped. It was the strangest thing. It ceased with a silence that felt practiced, like someone had trained the dark to obey a rule. For a full 30 seconds, the house held its breath. I told myself it was a trick of the mind, a pairing of stress and the storm. I told myself a lot of practical things and let them sit on the table like cold dishes. But when the sound returned, the pattern had changed. The dragging moved from shingles to the porch beams, low and close, as if someone were coming down head first along the rafters to find the joints that would support weight. The wood complained faintly, a tiny chorus of groans and sighs. Then, a soft exhale, nearly swallowed by the wind. Not the wind. A human breath pressed against the dark. Something pressed against a corner of the house and listened. I could feel that listening in my bones. My skin tightened. The cat, who had been dozing in the armchair, left without making a fuss. I walked to the door because standing still felt like a confession. I looked through the peephole. The porch light did what it could against the glaze of rain, painting the boards with a pale sting, and there was nothing, no shape, no shadow moving. But when I opened the door a crack and aimed the flashlight under the eaves, I saw prints, wet boot prints, spaced along the edge of the porch, leading to the front step and stopping an inch short of the threshold. They ended there, and nothing picked up where they left off. The sensation of being measured is small and specific. It is the feeling of having your pulse taken without consent, of someone mapping the soft places. I pressed my palm flat to the door and could feel cold seeping up through the boards, a thin knife of weather biting through. My first panicked option was to pull every bolt and call the sheriff. The storm made that thought fizzle. The county line is slow in storms, and the roads farther up the ridge are often impassable. A phone's battery read 30%, and the service icon winked like a joke. The night narrowed. The house became an island. The prince stopped at the threshold, felt like a score written for me. The night stretched and folded. Every few minutes, I heard movement on the roof again, and each time the flashlight came on, the sound died. It became an impossible little dance. Light, stop. Dark, return. The pressing problem altered. Whatever was outside knew how to obey light. That fact was worse than footprints. It meant an intelligence, or at least a caution, that planned for the bulb. I kept thinking of hunters, of men who read the world for signs. I thought of drifters who know the margins of houses, who take the parts that are exposed. None of that made the fear smaller. If anything, naming the possibilities made the world more claustrophobic, because names imply knowledge. Around 2 a.m, the rhythm changed. The steps stopped their slow pacing and became concentrated above the part of the roof covering the living room. Wood groaned in a way that suggested a heavier load had settled. A patient wait. Then came 3 sharp raps, close together. A fist on the roof that punched through the hush. The sound hit like a bell. It woke an old part of me that remembers ancestors and the animal call of danger. My pulse moved from a dull thud to a 2-beat drum. I counted in my head as if counting could translate into control. 1, 2, 3. The house answered with its own creaks, but the roof's reply was steady. Another rap, then a pause. The pattern felt deliberate. I pulled the blanket tighter, but it did nothing. I edged toward the hallway where the locked bedroom was and found that my hands had started to sweat despite the cold. My skin felt slick. My shirt clung. I thought about the shotgun my father kept in the closet, a bulky thing that smelled faintly of oil and old smoke. I thought about the keys in the bowl near the door and how stupid it would be to go out for them. Everything about the house felt suddenly foreign, as though I were an intruder in my own life. For a second, I considered simply driving down the road to the neighbor, but the lane would be a sheet of glass, and I did not trust my car to stay upright on it. The options narrowed with a cold, clean efficiency: stay and hope, or leave and risk open road. Shorter intervals passed. The knocking continued, but in no regular pattern. It became punctuation that insisted on response. Then the noise moved. I heard the faint scrape of rubber on wood closer to the front, a sound at the eaves, then a soft thump against the gutter. I darted to the window. The flashlight made the world bright and dead, as if color bled out when observed. When I shined the beam along the porch, the prints were darker and glistening, and they seemed nearer than before, as if someone had retread the boards quietly. Someone was listening to me breathe. It wasn't disguisable feeling. It sat beneath my ribs like a small stone. At that point, my options narrowed into a single line: stay and hope the weather kept the world from them, or try to get help and use the roads, which were treacherous. I calculated the risk and found both choices unsatisfying. While I hesitated, something new happened. A sound almost inside the house, like fabric dragged across dry wood. Then, the unmistakable sound of a hand running along the siding, slow and deliberate, as if cataloging each plank's grain. The movement had a tenderness that made my skin crawl. Whoever was outside touched the house the way someone would test the skin of a sleeping animal. Panic is precise. It clears everything down to the immediate: breath, pulse, the shape of an exit. My mind went into list mode. Throw the chair into the hall window to make noise, shout, break a pane, and light a signal fire. None of it felt smart. My palms were numb from the cold, and my fingers fumbled the knife I'd taken from the kitchen drawer, like an instrument I didn't know how to play. The light slipped from my grip, hit the floor, and the room wavered in a frantic jitter. In that low, flickering light, the scraping above the porch stopped. There was a stillness so complete, it felt predatory. My heart slammed. Then the door handle moved, an inch, then paused. The chain on the inside frame tensed. Something pressed against the door, slow and soft. A careful knock followed, low, patient, the kind that says neither hello nor open, but rather, remember me. I whispered no like a prayer. The handle moved again, closer, softer. The knock repeated in a slow, steady rhythm, as if someone told a story with knuckles. No voice that wanted entry. Just the sound of someone wanting the door to recall the shape of their hand. I held still. I felt every bead of sweat on my back. The cat emitted the small, feral sound animals make when they hear something they cannot classify. I gripped the knife until my knuckles whitened. The knocking continued, patient as a tide. Then it stopped. The door rested against its frame, like a mouth closed on a secret. The chain slumped. The silence returned, thicker than before, and for a long moment I did not breathe for fear that any sound would be an invitation. When I looked through the peephole, there was nothing but the gloss of ice and a dark yard. The prints remained on the step, wet and black against the pale wood. They ended where they had that first night, an inch from the threshold, as if someone had learned how far away they ought to be and obeyed the rule. Daylight came slow and oddly honest, burning the storm off in thin, quick breaths. The sheriff drove down the lane later with a polite skepticism and checked the roofline and the prints and made notes. He offered small theories: shelter for lost travelers, kids on a dare. He checked the attic and declared it untouched. He was all corners smoothed and hands in pockets. He left a card with a number and a courteous pat on my shoulder that felt like a bandage. I pretended to believe the sheriff. Outwardly, I moved through the day like a man recovering from a rough night. Inwardly, something had been rearranged. The house no longer felt like a place that belonged to memory. It belonged to attention. There was a new set of parameters I had not agreed to. Later, combing the yard, I found a length of rope under the porch steps, frayed and smelling faintly of fuel. Nearby, half buried in the slush, I found the corner of a cloth, a scrap of a sleeve or a scarf, damp and pegged to the earth like a loose prayer. It was the sort of evidence that made explanations harder, not proof of intent, but proof of planning. I stayed another night. I didn't sleep. I kept the radio on at low volume, the hiss of static like a nervous companion. Each time a light went out in the hills beyond, I imagined someone moving through the dark. I lit candles and watched them burn because the motion of flame seemed to offer some small rule to the chaos. When dawn came, I drove to town and signed my name on a list asking the county to fix the road. I had reasons that sounded procedural and sensible. Mostly, I was buying daylight and a community willing to watch. Community is a form of armor in the hills. Months passed. The prince never reappeared. The rope rotted under the porch, and the scarf vanished with the thaw. People in town spoke in the way people do about things they want to fold into ordinary days. A shrug at the diner, a passing mention, and then silence. My parents returned, thanked me for keeping the pipes from freezing, and life resumed its habitual slow pattern. But I carried a small, persistent memory I couldn't dislodge. The rhyme of boots on a roof, the way the sound had obeyed light, the scale of someone measuring a house as if it were a body to be mapped. I found myself leaving the porch light on when storms came, burning the radio to a low static like a ward. Sometimes at night now, when the wind hits a certain way and the old wood answers with a complaint, I think about that presence. I wonder if whoever it was ever considered me the kind of person to be watched. A keeper of a house, a warm body in a predictable place, an open pattern to be tried. I wonder if they came back the next winter and stood on ridges and listened, content with the knowledge that small things, a chair jammed under a knob, a flashlight kept on, are temporary measures people take before they go. I cannot prove the man was anything other than someone looking for shelter. I cannot prove he meant me harm. But there is a difference between seeking warmth and testing the limits of a door. I still wake sometimes in the dark, convinced I hear a soft scuff on the roof, and my hands go to the drawer with the knife without conscious thought. Fear has an arithmetic that does not simplify with time. You add precautions and subtract illusions of safety, and you are left with a ledger of small, precise actions. The house taught me one rule I didn't want: that safety is not a state, but a vigil. The memory sits patient in me like winter itself, cold, precise, and waiting. If you made it this far, subscribe for more true horror stories like this one. Some knocks don't ask permission. They announce that something outside already knows you're alone. I've spent most of my life in the mountains. I don't mean weekend hiking or a cabin you visit twice a year. I mean raised in them. The kind of back roads where neighbors are a mile apart and winters move in like a living thing. My parents' house sits in a hollow carved between two ridgelines. When the snow gets thick, the world shrinks down to the edges of your porch light. That Christmas, they were in Florida, visiting my sister. I'd volunteered to stay behind. Someone needed to watch the house, feed the dogs, and keep the wood stove alive so the pipes didn't freeze. I'd done it a dozen times before. I never minded the solitude. There's a kind of peace in it. The quiet you can only get when the nearest human being isn't close enough to hear you breathe. Christmas morning started the same as every other winter morning out there. Cold enough to bite my fingers when I touched the doorknob. The smell of last night's ashes drifting from the stove. A silence that settled on my shoulders like fresh snow. I got up early, padded across the cold floorboards, and opened the stove's iron mouth to build a fire. That's when I heard the knock. Not a polite one. Not the thump of a delivery driver or a lost neighbor. A frantic, uneven pounding that made the dogs in their crates downstairs stir and whine. My stomach tightened before I even stood up. Nobody comes to our door in winter unless they're expected. Even fewer show up before sunrise. I wiped the frost from the small window beside the door and squinted into the pale gray light. That's when I saw him. A man stood on the porch, hunched forward, his clothes dusted with snow. No coat, no gloves, just a thin sweater and jeans soaked dark around the knees. Snow clung to his hair like it had melted and refrozen on the way down. He wasn't shivering, though. That was the first thing that bothered me. If he'd truly been out all night, the cold should have been shaking him apart. His face lifted when he saw me behind the window. He smiled. A smile that didn't reach his eyes. A smile that wasn't relief or gratitude or fear. Just recognition. I cracked the door the smallest amount I could without feeling ridiculous. Enough for my voice to slip through, but not enough for a hand. "You okay?" I asked. His voice came out steady. Too steady. Wrecked my truck down the road. Need warmth. Something about the way he said warmth made the hair on the back of my neck rise. Not warmth like a plea. Not warmth like survival. Warmth like access. "Where's your truck?" I asked. He didn't answer. His gaze drifted past me, into the cabin behind my shoulder. His eyes traced the living room, the hallway light I'd forgotten to turn off, the half-built fire at my feet. Then he said, almost softly, "You're not alone in there, are you?" My throat closed. I hadn't said a word about being alone. I hadn't even stepped fully into view. I managed a quiet, "I am." His smile sharpened, not wider, just more certain. "I thought so," he murmured. Then he stepped forward, slow, deliberate. I slammed the door so fast it shook the frame. The dogs downstairs barked wildly. I locked every deadbolt, every chain, and then backed away until I hit the kitchen counter. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Just the pulse thundering in my ears and the faint crackle of the stove fire trying to catch. Then I heard something brush against the siding. A fingertip, a hand, fabric. It slid along the wall like someone was tracing the shape of the house with their palm. I held my breath. Then the tapping began. Light, testing, moving from window to window as he circled the cabin. The kind of tapping someone does when searching for a hollow spot in a wall. The dogs barked until their voices cracked, but the man didn't flinch at the sound. If anything, he seemed to hum along with them. A quiet, tuneless melody threading through the tapping. He circled once, twice, 3 times, each pass slower than the last, like he was studying something, learning something. At one point, his shadow drifted across the kitchen window. He paused there, inches from the glass, close enough that I could see the faint outline of his cheek. He leaned forward, and the window fogged. He was breathing on it. I dropped beneath the counter instinctively, heart pounding so hard my ribs hurt. The floor was freezing against my palms. I stayed there, pressed against the cabinets, listening to his slow footsteps recede toward the back of the house. Then silence. I didn't trust it. Silence with intention always feels thick, like the world is waiting for your next mistake. After what might have been 5 minutes or an hour, time stopped working normally. I crept toward the small window above the kitchen sink. The glass was fogged from the inside. I wiped a circle with my sleeve. Outside, the porch steps were empty. Relief hit me so fast, it almost made me dizzy. But a second later, I noticed the footprints. A set of wet prints ran from the front steps toward the back of the house. Deep impressions. Heavy. Too evenly spaced for someone stumbling from the cold. And next to them, another set. Smaller, lighter, fresh. 2 people, or 2 passes. One set leading toward the back door. One set leading away. Every instinct in me screamed to run. But where? The road was buried under ice. The nearest neighbor was unreachable without hiking gear and daylight. I grabbed the phone from the wall. Dead. The lines were down from the storm. I felt the house shrink around me. I shut every curtain, locked every possible lock, pushed furniture in front of though I knew it would barely slow anyone down. Then I grabbed the poker from the stove and held it like a weapon. The tapping started again. This time at the bedroom window down the hallway, then the bathroom window, then the living room. Slow, methodical taps, that spaced themselves out like a heartbeat. I didn't go near them. I didn't want him to know where I was inside the house. Instead, I sat on the floor, back against the wall, staring at the front door as if it might answer for me. At some point, the tapping stopped abruptly. No fade, no footsteps, just stopped. Then came the humming, soft at first, then louder. A Christmas tune, angels we have heard on high, except it wasn't sung. It was breathed, whispered, more air than sound. It moved along the exterior of the house, drifted, shifted, sometimes high, sometimes low, like he was turning his head while he hummed. The tune bent in places, wrong notes slipping in, as though he didn't fully remember the melody. I covered my ears. It didn't help. The sound sunk through the wood, through the insulation, straight into my skull. And then, a knock, directly above my head, on the window behind me. 3 slow knocks, spaced evenly. I stood up so fast my legs almost collapsed. "No," I whispered without meaning to. "Please, no." Another knock. Closer this time, like he'd leaned in. I forced myself to peek around the edge of the curtain. Nothing. Just snow drifting across the yard. I should have looked relieved. I wasn't, because something else caught my eye. The footprints were gone, all of them, every set, but it wasn't snowing hard enough to cover them that fast. Someone had brushed them away. At that moment, something nudged the back door. A soft push, like a knuckle dragged along the wood. Then, a wisp. My whole body locked up. My mouth went dry. My heart hammered against my ribs so loudly, I thought he might hear it through the walls. He pushed again, harder. The door rattled. The frame shook. A hinge squealed. "No, no, no." The words tumbled out of me without thought. I pressed my back against the opposite wall, gripping the stove poker with numb fingers. Then, bang. The back door slammed inward half an inch before the deadbolt caught it. Bang. Another shove, harder this time. The deadbolt groaned. Bang. I stumbled backward, breath coming in panicked gasps. I could feel the cold leaking through the crack where the door strained against the lock. Then, everything stopped. Silence. Not the soft kind, the thick, unnatural kind. The kind that means someone is holding their breath right next to you. I didn't move. I didn't blink. For a moment, I thought he'd slipped inside without a sound. Then, my whole body locked up. My mouth went dry. My heart hammered against my ribs so loudly, I thought he might hear it through the walls. He pushed again, harder. The door rattled. The frame shook. The hinge squealed. "No, no, no, no." The words tumbled out of me without thought. I pressed my back against the opposite wall, gripping the stove poker with numb fingers. Then, bang. The back door slammed inward half an inch before the deadbolt caught it. Bang. Another shove, harder this time. The deadbolt groaned. Bang. I stumbled backward, breath coming in panicked gasps. I could feel the cold leaking through the crack where the door strained against the lock. Then everything stopped. Silence. Not the soft kind. The thick, unnatural kind. The kind that means someone is holding their breath right next to you. I didn't move. I didn't blink. For a moment, I thought he'd slipped inside without a sound. Then, footsteps creaked across the porch. Slow, measured, leaving this time. I stayed frozen for at least an hour, maybe 2. I didn't dare check the window. I didn't dare make noise. I waited until the sun began bleeding gray across the ridge before I finally forced myself to look outside. He was gone, but the snow told the truth. 2 sets of footprints again, one leading to the back door, one leading away. Except the set going away wasn't deep like the others. They were light, barely there, as if whoever made them weighed almost nothing, or walked on their toes. I packed my things before the sun fully rose. I drove down the iced road at a crawl, hands shaking the whole time. I told my parents the storm scared me more than the truth. I didn't want to explain what didn't make sense. But sometimes, late at night, I think about the man's voice, the way it stayed steady, the way he didn't shiver. I think about the footprints that doubled back, the humming, the fog on, and the way he asked if I was alone, not like a question, like a confirmation, like he already knew. And I can't shake the feeling that he didn't come for warmth. He came to see who the house belonged to now. If you made it this far, subscribe for more true horror stories like this one.